And
Thomas Hardy, the novels, the novelist, and Puddletown. So thanks very much for allowing me on, for Michael and Lorraine for inviting me, for Lisa for hosting, and for you all having the patience to come along. If you do find, because obviously we're on different time zones, I'm sending you to sleep with my talk. I won't be offended if you have an early night, so you can always pick it up at the end on catch up. I better start though, because all my talks tend to be self-indulgent and long, so I better get on with it straight away by telling you this is going to be Thomas Hardy, the novels, the novelist, and Puddletown. Now, I expect that you're all pretty sure that you're all familiar with Thomas Hardy. You know what a novel is, you know what a novelist is. Some of you may not know what Puddletown is or was, even though it does sound like something out of a Beatrix Potter picture book. But for those who don't, here's a map of Great Britain and Ireland, with the area known as Hardy's Wessex circled in red. And on the left, Hardy's own map of Wessex, named after an ancient Saxon kingdom, of course, with Puddletown as the area circled in yellow. It's no great offence if you don't know what Puddletown is, because it's there's only about 1,452 of us. But it's very important in Hardy's life. And here's another, hopefully clearer map of Hardy's Dorset, one of the counties which make up Wessex, with Puddletown the smaller red circle and Hardy's birthplace at Higher Bockhampton with the larger red circle. In between is Puddletown Forest, part of what Hardy would have called Egdon Heath. Puddletown is on the River Piddle and was in Hardy's time known as Puddletown, but I'll spare your sensibilities by giving it its modern name throughout this talk. You may have heard of a village 2.5 miles away called Tolpuddle, but as the Tolpuddle martyrs were incarcerated in 1834, this is just outside our Victorian remit. 4.5 miles in the other direction is the county town of Dorchester, and a 50-minute walk across Puddletown Forest will take you to Thomas Hardy's birthplace. So this talk is about Thomas Hardy, the novelist, not the villain from the Batman film played by the actor, not Thomas Hardy, the 16th century merchant who founded a school in Dorchester, nor Kiss Me Hardy of the Battle of Trafalgar, but Thomas Hardy, the novelist, commemorated in his native town of Dorchester by this statue by Eric Kennington. It was unveiled by J.M. Barrie of Peter Pan fame in 1931. And beneath the statue are Hardy's own all-important dates. So he was born on the 2nd of June 1840 and died on the 11th of January 1928, 95 years ago next Wednesday by my estimate. And these are the elderly Thomas Hardy, getting younger and younger as time goes by, as we all do, of course, until you find that he grew a beard in 1872, reverted to a mustache in the 1890s, and here he is as a 21-year-old. Not all the slides will be that fast, but I thought we'd better see who we're talking about. So what I'm going to try and do is to spin 3 plates during the talk. So he wrote 14 novels, 47 short stories, and nearly 1,000 poems, so 947 at the last count. So I'm going to attempt to mention each of the novels in turn, so there are 14 of them, interweaving details of his life and passing references to Puddletown when appropriate. It could have been Oxford or London or anywhere in Dorset, really, but it's a self-indulgent talk, so I'm going to talk about Puddletown. Let's get started. So his first novel was called Desperate Remedies. It was published anonymously in 1871, and like all of the first 4 novels, it was written for the most part in the cottage at Higher Bockhampton, where Hardy was living when at 27 he returned from working in London. It's not, however, the first novel he wrote. His first novel was called The Poor Man and His Lady, written between 1867 and 1868, but he couldn't get it published because it was a bitter satire and too critical of the ruling classes. It was rejected by several publishers as being too socialistic. However, the author George Meredith, who was the reader for Chapman and Hall, did read it and suggested that the young 28-year-old should try his hand at the sensation novel, which was very much in vogue at the time. So think of Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Braddon, or The Woman in White, or The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. The Moonstone had just been serialised and published in 1868, so it was a good choice. Hardy duly obliged and produced a novel with a Victorian villain, Aeneas Marston, murder, bigamy, suicide, a lesbian relationship, and a body in a bread oven. It's a real potboiler. He paid £70 for the privilege, and the publishers received £59 back in sales. Desperate Remedies is set in South Dorset, with scenes in Corfe Castle, Tolpuddle, and Weymouth, from where the orphaned brother and sister, Owen and Cytherea Gray, take a boat trip to Lulworth Cove, shown here. Here, Cytherea first encounters the man she falls in love with, called Edward Springrove. Its main location, though, is in two properties which form part of the Kingston Moorwood estate near Higher Bockhampton. The large white house called Knapwater House, where Cytherea Gray becomes lady's maid to Miss Aldclyffe, also called Cytherea. And on the right, the old mansion house where the villainous Aeneas Manston, the illegitimate son of Mr. Aldclyffe, comes to live. Both these properties would have been familiar to Thomas Hardy because they are close to where he was born, and his family story starts here. Now, the story goes that King George III, shown there, was making one of his frequent trips to Weymouth to swim and drink the seawater. No wonder he went mad. He stopped at Kingston Moorwood House on his way with the Pitt family, cousins of the Prime Minister who owned it. He also sometimes stayed at Ilsington House in Puddletown, where his equerry, General Garth, raised the child of an incestuous encounter between two of George III's children, Sophia and Prince Ernest Augustus, but that is another story. Anyway, Kingston Moorwood was covered in red brick, and the king made some sarcastic remark about not liking it. And it's the pits, perhaps. In a panic, his hosts searched around for a builder to cover their house in Portland stone, and they found one in Puddletown called John Hardy, who had a son called Thomas, also a builder. So the great-grandfather was called John Hardy, and then they had a failure with the imagination and called everybody Thomas Hardy after that. In 1799, Thomas had recently married Mary Head, a woman from Fawley in West Berkshire, at Puddletown's St. Mary the Virgin Parish Church. And the cottage that John was allowed to build on the edge of the heath was for the newlyweds. It was a simple cottage with 2 rooms upstairs and 1 down. It was cob built using any local materials to hand: sand, gravel, straw, and mud. Here together, Hardy's grandparents, Thomas and Mary, raised 7 children, 3 boys and 4 girls, one of whom died in infancy. And that's the cottage in winter. It was at the end of a narrow lane on the edge of what was then open heathland, stretching across South Dorset and into Hampshire. At the time, there was about 80,000 acres, or 125 square miles, in 1811, when the first maps were made, which made up what Hardy later called Egdon Heath. But this was on the edge of it. Hardy put these words into his grandmother's mouth in a poem he wrote about her when she died in 1857. It's called Domicilium. Our house stood quite alone, and those tall firs and beeches were not planted. Snakes and efts swarmed in the summer days, and nightly bats would fly about our bedrooms. Heathcroppers, the ponies, you see, heathcroppers lived on the hills and were our only friends. So wild it was when first we settled here. Now, our Thomas Hardy didn't know his grandfather because he died in 1837, 3 years before he was born. But he loved to come and sit down by his grandmother's feet and hear stories about him. And he was an interesting character. He'd been a musician, a bass, viol, or cello player who led 2 West Gallery choirs, one in Puddletown and one in Stinsford. He'd been a smuggler. Everybody in Dorset's a smuggler, hiding contraband in his house until Mary Head, his wife, put a foot down in 1805 and said, "You're not doing it." And he stopped. And most interestingly of all for Hardy, he'd been in the militia when Dorset was in the front line awaiting the invasion of Napoleon. He would draw on this family history when he came to write The Trumpet Major and his poetic drama, The Dynasts. It should also be said that Hardy's grandmother was also a remarkable individual. When grandfather died in 1837, she took over the running of the family building business, and along with 2 of her sons, James and Thomas, built what amounts to a very impressive granny flat. From the chimney in the middle to the thatch on the right-hand side was her granny flat. She had her own entrance doorway, her own rooms upstairs. And when she died in 1857, the two parts of the cottage were joined together and a porch added. And that's the cottage we see today. Many of you will have visited, and if you haven't, make sure you come on a Thursday when I volunteer there. His second novel, Under the Greenwood Tree. Well, when in 1872 Hardy came to write his second novel in this very cottage, he set his story there as well. Hardy's home became Tranter Dewey's cottage, where the tranter's son, Dick Dewey, lived. It was subtitled A Rural Painting of the Dutch School, and unlike many Hardy novels, ends happily. This time, Tinsley's paid Thomas Hardy £30 for publishing rights, and again it was published anonymously. A year later, it was taken by an American publisher and became the first novel published there. Inside the cottage is the parlour, where under the greenwood tree there are couples dancing at a Christmas Day party. And as soon as the clock struck midnight, they weren't allowed to dance before that. It must have been tight. From his grandfather, Hardy would have inherited the love of music, which would make him not only a musician himself, he could play a squeeze box from the age of 4 and tune a violin soon afterwards. And there are lovely stories of him as a teenager coming back with his father in the early hours of the morning with a violin slung over his shoulder after playing a celebration at a wedding. And another story of the hostess making him stop after 45 minutes because she thought he was going to burst a blood vessel. So he was a musician, but also throughout his life, he was a collector of music as well. Now, Under the Greenwood Tree tells the story of the Mellstock Choir, a West Gallery choir and band who, like his father and grandfather, played at the nearby Stinsford Church. The story opens on Christmas Eve. Every 2 years, at Christmas time, the new Hardy Players, Ridgway Singers, Thomas Hardy Society and others follow in the footsteps of the Mellstock Choir and parade around the locations associated with the novel. So here they're in the churchyard of Stinsford, acting out a short story called Absent-Mindedness in a Parish Choir. If you haven't read it, by all means do. It's quite funny. It must have been passed down by Hardy's grandfather. You may recognise the white-haired vicar on the left. One of the locations we go to, though, in visiting, going the rounds, is the schoolroom at Lower Bockhampton, where Hardy himself first went to school. You can see the school bell on the right of the picture. 8-year-old Thomas was the first pupil to arrive when it first opened, but only spent a year there before Jemima removed him because she felt that Julia Martin, the lady of the manor who had built the school, was getting a little too affectionate. After a stay with his Aunt Martha Sharp in Hatfield, Jemima enrolled him in the nonconformist school of Isaac Last in Dorchester, where he stayed until he was 16. In the novel, it's here in the schoolhouse that Fancy Day lives and works, the subject of a love triangle of interest from Farmer Shiner, Parson Maybold, and Dick Dewey, the tranter's son. Now, at the end of the novel, when Fancy finally does marry, it would not have been in this church that they marry in, oh no, but this one. And this is the church of St. Mary, the Virgin in Puddletown. And they married there because Keeper Day, Fancy's father, lives in Yalbury Wood or Yellowham Wood, which is in that parish. It's also here that Bathsheba Everdeen and Gabriel Oak would have been married in Far From the Madding Crowd, and arguably Tess and Angel Clare in Tess of the D'Urberville. So I'm claiming that for Puddletown. And while we're talking about marriages, we ought to talk about Hardy's parents. There they are. Jemima on the left looks it. She could be fierce. She looks like a Roman general, but she was also a determined mother who believed strongly in education. She had an alcoholic, abusive father who died young, left her and her family and her siblings in poverty, so much that at the age of 13, she was working as a maidservant in a large house for relatives of the Earls of Ilchester, first at Melbury Osmond, then at Maiden Newton, and then by 1839 in Stinsford, near to Bockhampton. Here she met Thomas Hardy the builder, the eldest son of the Thomas Hardy who first lived in the cottage. And as this picture suggests, you can tell, can't you, he was a little more laid back. In fact, he was so laid back that when Jemima became pregnant, he decided he didn't want to marry her. Now, that was unusual, not that she was pregnant, but that he didn't want to marry her. Jemima's response was to send her brother-in-law, James Sparks, who lived in Puddletown. He came across the hill, he twisted young Thomas's arm, they marched across the heath, they got lost on the way, they consumed a flagon of cider, and eventually they reached Melbury Osmond Church just in time for the wedding on the 22nd of December 1839. Their son, also called Thomas Hardy, our Thomas Hardy, was born in the cottage at Higher Bockhampton on the 2nd of June 1840, 6 months later. Thomas was not the only child. He had a sister Mary, born a year later, 1841, a brother Henry, born 11 years later, 1851, and a sister Kate, who was born 5 years after that. Henry would grow up to take over the family building business, while Mary and Kate would both become teachers. Mary became a head teacher and was once sacked for being too strict. Quite an achievement in a Victorian school, I would have thought. Jemima was a strong believer in education, as I've said, but she didn't want any of her children to marry. She wanted the older pair and the younger pair to stay together for life. So two together and she would always be the power behind the throne. You wouldn't have wanted to cross Jemima, of course. They were all good children and did as their mum said, apart from Thomas, our Thomas, who married twice. His third novel was called A Pair of Blue Eyes. Now, this time he was able to negotiate a good fee, £200, for it to be serialised in Tinsley's magazine between September 1872 and July 1873. It was the first novel to be published under Thomas Hardy's own name. The others were published as anonymous. It's set in North Cornwall and tells the tale of Elfriede Swancourt, the daughter of a wealthy clergyman who's courted by three men: an impoverished architect, Stephen Smith, and Henry Knight, a more respectable Victorian naturalist and intellectual, as well as the Lord of the Manor, Lord Luxellian. The novel does contain some autobiographical elements. In 1872, Hardy was himself, like Stephen Smith, an architect's assistant, very much aware of his social status, while Henry Knight is based on his intellectual friend and mentor, Horace Mole. It's most famous for the incident where Henry Knight slips down the cliff face at Beanie Cliff and has to be rescued most shockingly. Now, cover your ears, gentlemen, of a sensitive disposition. Most shockingly by Elfriede disappearing for a moment and ripping off her underwear to make these nether garments into a rope. Shocking indeed. The moment that Henry Knight was left dangling over the cliff, looking eye to eye with a trilobite, ended the serialized chapter and gave the world of the novel, the film and television series, the phrase "a cliffhanger." Henry Knight's fall was in the February issue. Readers had to wait a whole month for his rescue. This, though, is written before that. This is a picture of Thomas Hardy as a 16-year-old on the left there, still living in the cottage at Higher Bockhampton. He's 16, he's just left school, and he's just begun a 4-year apprenticeship as an architect's assistant with a man called John Hicks in Dorchester. And that's the plaque in Dorchester that you would see. And on the right-hand side, here he is as an 18-year-old. By 18 years old, he'd got into very good habits. So his normally daily routine would be to study for 2 hours, because he was an autodidact, to go out to work, and then to come back and play the violin or concertina. At 16, though, he felt himself to be a man of the world and ready to witness his first public hanging, which he did for a bit of entertainment in those days. Having walked into Dorchester with a friend, he climbed a tree to get a better view. When Martha Brown had caught her abusive husband in a compromising situation, she berated him for it. He had taken a whip to her and she had taken an axe to him. She told the police and the court that her husband had been kicked to death by a horse on the doorstep. They weren't convinced. Her death made a vivid impression on Hardy, and he would remember this incident when he came to write Tess of the D'Urbervilles 35 years later. And at 18, he witnessed his second hanging. I did say this is a macabre talk, didn't I? On the right is Rushy Pond, just above the cottage. On this particular day, he's having his breakfast when he suddenly remembered that there was another hanging taking place in Dorchester at 8 a.m. So taking his father's heavy telescope, he rushed up the hill to Rushy Pond and just caught the man's drop, a 19-year-old murderer and arsonist called James Searle. This also affected him greatly. He would make reference to it in one of his most famous short stories called The Withered Arm. And if you want a macabre short story by Thomas Hardy, that's probably the one to read. His fourth novel, though, was the one which put his name on the literary map, Far from the Madding Crowd. It was serialised in the Cornhill magazine between January and December 1874. It was, in terms of success, like winning Pop Idol, The Bake Off, Strictly Come Dancing, all rolled into one. And I'm sure there are international equivalents you could think of. And it meant that he could give up his career as an architect's assistant and devote his time fully to writing. Leslie Stephen, the editor of the Cornhill magazine, the most prestigious literary magazine of the day, and later father of Virginia Woolf, had read Under the Greenwood Tree and wrote to Hardy to suggest that he might be able to publish one of his novels in the Cornhill magazine. Far from the Madding Crowd was the result. It was serialised. Now, the story goes that it was a very untypical Dorset day because it was very, very wet and very windy. And the very lazy postman, rather than walk the 600 yards down to the cottage, decided to give a pile of letters to the children at the end of the lane. They ran down the lane as fast as they could, and the one letter they dropped in the mud was, of course, the one from Leslie Stephen. Now, had that been a Hardy novel, it'd still be there now. He would have ended up living in a garret, died in poverty, and possibly hanged himself. But luckily for Hardy, one of the building labourers, and because it was real life, picked it up and brought it down, so he actually got the big break he needed. You may well know that the two very good film versions of Far from the Madding Crowd, people who have seen the 1967 would be quite right in thinking it was set in Shaftesbury, in fact, on Gold Hill. Or if you'd seen the 2015 one with Carrie Mulligan, you might think it was set in Sherborne, which is there. So choose either Julie Christie or Carrie Mulligan for your ideal Bathsheba Everdeen, pursued by three suitors: the dashing but villainous Sergeant Troy, the lovesick but uninspiring Farmer Boldwood, or the heroic and worthy ruined shepherd Gabriel Oak. The novel, though, is clearly not set there. It's set in Puddletown, or Weatherbury, as it's called in the novel. This is the picture of Puddletown's church, drawn by Helen Patterson when it was first published in the Cornhill magazine, and included as the frontispiece of the first published edition of the novel. Here, the hero of the novel, Gabriel Oak, sings in the choir and encounters Fanny Robin on his way to the nearby Warren's Malthouse. So if you were to go right out of the picture and behind the houses, you'd be able to find the site of Warren's Malthouse. And that tree there, I'm sure, is the one that Fanny Robin was sat underneath when he came across her. The church, though, is best remembered for the scene when Fanny Robin, Sergeant Troy's jilted lover, is buried. Sergeant Troy plants flowers on her grave and sleeps in the north porch, and wakes to find that the rain rushing down from the gargoyle above has washed the flowers away. And today, if you go into the churchyard and you look closely, using your fertile imagination, you can still see the rain gushing out of the gargoyle's mouth and the spot where she's buried and where the flowers were washed away. Bathsheba's farmhouse in the novel, when Hardy envisaged it, was actually within the confines of the town, but it was based on two houses. One was 2 miles away, it's called Waterston Manor, shown there, and another one was Athelhampton House, which is about a mile walk, or under a mile's walk from Puddletown, which I'll show you a picture of later. And you may know about the Hardy tree. Let's get back to Hardy's life. Just before his 22nd birthday, he decided that he needed to see the world and therefore set out for London, where he was employed by the well-known architect Arthur Blomfield. He lived first in Kilburn and then at Westbourne Park Villas near Paddington Station. Perhaps Hardy's most famous task was to move the bodies from the churchyard at St Pancras so that the railway station could be expanded. The gravestones were laid against an ash tree, and in time the stones in the tree became intertwined even. Until recently, this tree, known as the Hardy tree, could still be seen in situ. A week ago, wind and weather took its toll and knocked it down. We hope they're going to take a sapling from Dorset to replace it. As a young man, Hardy would almost inevitably fall in love. His cousin Martha Sparks, the most beautiful daughter of the James Sparks of Puddletown, who had twisted the arm of his father in 1839, was a maidservant in London, and he had a brief flirtation with her before falling for another maidservant, Eliza Nichols, daughter of a Dorset coastguard who lived near his Westbourne Villas home in North London. His first volume of poetry, Wessex Poems, published in 1898, still contained a pen and ink drawing by Hardy, one of 31 in the volume, of two figures walking up together to the Clavel Tower on the coast at Kimmeridge Bay. These are Hardy and Eliza Nichols. You can just about see them on the right there, visiting the Coast Guard lookout as used by her father. But I am going to claim his love interest at this time in his life for Puddletown. By 1867, Hardy had returned to Dorset after being in London and turned his attention to his young cousin, Tryphena Sparks. She was the youngest daughter of James Sparks and sister of Rebecca, Martha, James, and Nathaniel, very close cousins who Hardy grew up with. Hardy had frequently visited them. By 1867, Tryphena was a pupil teacher at the school in Puddletown. Hardy, recently returned from London, was asked to give her French lessons, and he willingly obliged. He was 11 years her senior. He flirted with her and would meet up at the Eweleys, the meadow where the sheep would go, at the Eweleys shown here, which was halfway between his home at Higher Bockhampton and hers near the mill in Puddletown. When his poem entitled In a Eweleys Near Weatherbury was published in Wessex Poems in 1898, it was accompanied by a pen and ink drawing in Hardy's own hand of a pair of spectacles focusing on the place where they would meet. A more famous poem was the one he wrote for her when she died in 1890, called Thoughts on Fina. According to Hardy, he began writing this poem on a train journey when, unbeknown to him, she was dying. It begins with the words I've quoted here. Not a line of her writing have I, not a thread of her hair, not a mark of a late time as dame in her dwelling whereby I may picture her there. The suggestion that he gave her a ring is true. The suggestion that he gave her a child is not. Tryphena, though, would now be superseded by a stronger affection. By 1869, John Hicks had died, and Hardy was employed by a Weymouth architect called George Crickmay to restore churches, as Hicks had done. Here, for example, is the beautiful owl corbel designed by Hardy that you can still see today in Turnworth Church, and the drawings that he would make in the church of St. Juliot near Boscastle. Thus it was that on the 7th of March 1870, he was sent by Crickmay to restore a church in St. Juliot in North Cornwall, near Boscastle. It was 4 o'clock in the morning when he got up. He walked the 3 miles to Dorchester. He took a train to Plymouth. He took a train from Plymouth to Launceston. He got a dog cart across Bodmin Moor, miles and miles, the 70 mile to St. Juliot. Tired and exhausted, he arrived at the rectory. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was dark again, and he walked down and knocked on the door. He expected the very ugly vicar, the Reverend Cadell Holder, to open the door for him. Actually, I don't know whether it was ugly or not, but it's a better story if he was. But the very ugly vicar, it was upstairs in bed with gout. And who should open the door but the vicar's sister-in-law, the pre-Raphaelite beauty, Emma Lavinia Gifford. She was the daughter of a Plymouth solicitor, interested in art and literature, and a class above Hardy's own. And there she is. He fell instantly in love, extended his stay to a week, and returned to Higher Bockhampton, as he said in his poem entitled Leoness, with magic in his eyes. He had a 4-year courtship, often by letter, was inspired to write A Pair of Blue Eyes because of her, and when he had sold the rights to Far From the Madding Crowd to the Cornhill magazine, he could afford to defy his mother, who didn't want any of them to marry, and her parents, who regarded the Hardys as a family of churls because they worked with their hands, and go down to London to be married on the 17th of September by one of her uncles, 1874. Dr. Edwin Hamilton Gifford, the canon of Worcester Cathedral. Neither sets of parents attended. He gave her the ring he'd originally intended for Tryphena. His 5th novel, Far From the Madding Crowd, was a great success. His next novel, The Hand of Ethelberta, again serialized in the Cornhill magazine from July 1875 to January 1876, then published in 2 volumes in 1876, was less successful. Unlike many a Hardy novel, it does have a happy ending, with the heroine, Ethelberta, a woman of humble origins who has risen above her status, being pursued by 4 suitors, including the well-named Mr. Ney, who mistreats his horses. Make of that what you like. She has to keep quiet about her butler father, labouring brothers, and maidservant sister, called Pickety, but triumphs over the rich and powerful at the end. The novel begins in Wareham and has scenes in Bournemouth and Corfe Castle, as well as Rouen, where Hardy had honeymooned, and London, where they had lodgings in Surbiton. Most interesting, though, he sets the novel also in Swanage on the coast, at a time when Hardy and his new wife, Emma, were living there. They stayed for 8 months in the house of a sea captain. This is a picture of Ethelberta with her sister Pickety walking on the beach at Swanage, an illustration from the Cornhill magazine drawn by George du Maurier, who was the grandfather of the famous Daphne. They then moved to from Swanage after a holiday in Holland, Germany, and Belgium. They took lodgings at 7 Peter Street in Yeovil. But I wouldn't bother looking for that. It's underneath a car park. Before moving to Sturminster Newton in July 1876, where he was to spend his happiest 21 months with Emma. It was here in Sturminster Newton that he wrote The Return of the Native, serialized in the Belgravia magazine from January and December 1878, after being rejected by 3 publishers. The magazine, edited by Mary Elizabeth Braddon of Lady Audley's Secret fame, specialized in sensation fiction. The novel is set close to his childhood home of Higher Bockhampton. He used the cottage where he was born as the model for Bloom's End. This is clear from the map he published to accompany the first edition of the novel, which unusually is orientated east to west rather than north to south. Mistover Nap there on the left, the hill to the left of the Central Valley, is the home of the 19-year-old heroine Eustacia Vi. It's a short walk from Puddletown, while Black Barrow is Rain Barrows on the right. Bloom's End is the home of Mrs. Yearbright, who bears many of Jemima's characteristics, and she's the mother of Clym Yearbright. It's also where the Mummers play takes place, where Eustacia Vi dresses up as a mummer. Clym had returned from Paris to live the life of a furs cutter and to have the tragic love affair with the beautiful Eustacia Vi, who is herself in love with the newly married Damon Wildeve. Nearby is the wild landscape of Egnan Heath, with its distinctive Bronze Age barrows of Rain Barrows, which gives the novel a sense of timelessness and where the novel begins and ends. Here are some recent photographs and Rain Barrows painted by Hardy himself in 1872. And this was his house, Riverside Villas, the semi-detached house he had on the River Stour in Sturminster Newton. Hardy's house is the one on the left, and for many years, the plaque recording Hardy's time there was put on the wrong house. While he was living there, he and Emma had a servant girl from Stalbridge nearby, who Emma discovered with her boyfriend in the house. She ran off, and Hardy went to Stalbridge in search of her. She would later become one of the 3 models for Tess. Sturminster Newton would later appear as Stour Castle in that novel. I'll say it was where he had his happiest years with Emma. He saw the house as an idyllic place, with a walk along the River Stour to the mill and boating on the river, frequent pastimes. And that's the Sturminster Mill, where the swallows flew in the curves of an 8 above the river gleam. Soon, though, they decided that they really wanted to go and explore London society. He is becoming very well known as an author by now. And so in March 1878, they moved to London. And while there, he wrote his only historical novel, The Trumpet Major, serialized in a magazine called Good Words. It's a novel inspired by his grandfather, who's in the Dorset militia, awaiting the invasion by Napoleon. And who, like the characters in the book, experienced the lighting of the beacons on Rain Barrows and a false alarm. This is the picture Hardy drew of his grandfather to accompany the poem called The Alarm, in his 1898 collection, Wessex Poems. He included the incident describing the poem by his grandfather in The Trumpet Major. The novel also contains real historical characters like Vice Admiral Thomas Hardy, whose monument representing an inverted ship's telescope can still be seen today overlooking Martinstown next to Dorchester. In the novel, the character Bob Loveday walks from Sutton Point to Portisham, Possum the locals call it, to ask the Vice Admiral's permission to enlist on the Victory. Or there's my favourite scene in the novel when King George III is bathing for his health in Weymouth Bay with a band in an adjacent bathing hut. And every time his head comes above the water, the band breaks into God Save the King. It must have been quite enjoyable for them and for him, I would think. The Trumpet Major is the story of Anne Garland and her three suitors, the brothers John and Bob Loveday, and the cowardly and pompous nephew of the local squire, Festus Derryman. It's set in the villages of Sutton Point and Poxwell on the Dorset coast. And this is the house in Tooting where Hardy and Emma lived for 3 years between 1878 and 1881. Hardy would later claim that this is where his troubled relationship began. He was able to join a club, Savills, to mix with polite literary society, where, for example, he had met one of his literary heroes, Robert Browning, and to visit the British Museum for his research into the Napoleonic Wars. After 3 years, though, he became very ill with a stomach hemorrhage, or perhaps a bladder infection, which confined him to bed between October and April, during which time he had spent 7 months with his feet raised high on his head. He thought he was dying, and the last few chapters of his next novel were dictated for Emma to transcribe. And that novel was A Laodicean, or to give it its full title, A Laodicean, or The Castle of the Distances, A Story of Today. A Laodicean, as you no doubt all know, is a biblical reference to the book of Revelations and refers to a person who's half-hearted or indifferent. And this refers to the lead character, Paula Power, the wealthy daughter of a railway magnate who has inherited a castle and who's lukewarm in love and in faith. She refuses full immersive baptism. The castle she inherits was based on Dunster Castle in Somerset, and here she employs an architect aptly named George Somerset to restore it. He falls in love with her, but has a rival for her affections from another man with an inherited title, a Captain de Stancy, with his scheming illegitimate son, William Dare, a stereotypical mustache-twirling Victorian villain with a modern twist. He has the skill to doctor photographs and telegrams. Hardy didn't die in London, but he needed the well-known cure of a return to Dorset. In 1881, they found a house in the Minster town of Wimborne. It's a solid but ordinary-looking suburban property. It was conveniently situated near the railway station so that he could often travel to London to see his publisher and to mix with society. Emma now travelled less frequently with him. It was while living in Wimborne that he wrote his next novel, Two on a Tower, serialized in the American magazine Atlantic Monthly. It's about another wealthy heiress, Lady Viviette Constantine, who secretly marries an impoverished young astronomer called Swithin St. Cleeve, when she mistakenly thinks her husband has died of malaria while hunting lions in Africa, as you do. She's also pursued by a bishop who wants to marry her. A year after the publication of Two on a Tower in 1883, Hardy was on the move again, and this time he was to return to Dorchester to be near his family home where his parents and brother Henry were still living. While finding temporary accommodation in a house which is no longer there in the centre of Dorchester near Shire Hall, he purchased a piece of land in what was then an ancient setting, Conker Down, on the outskirts of town. He designed and his father and brother built the house known as Mack's Gate. This is a bit of a joke, really. It's a humorous reference to Henry Mack, M-A-C-K, who had been the turnpike keeper nearby earlier in the century. He moved in 1885. It was at Mack's Gate that he would write some of his most famous novels, as well as becoming a justice of the peace an active member of the Dorset County Museum, and a supporter of the Liberal Party. It's a rambling architect-designed house and not to everyone's taste. As an antiquarian, Hardy was particularly impressed by the house's location next to a long barrow, by this ancient druid stone that he found beneath this lawn in 1891, and by some Roman remains. It was also during this time at Maxgate that he and Emma took up cycling. It was she who persuaded him. They would ride together about the Dorset countryside, including a 34-mile round trip to Turnworth, and a return by moonlight in 1899 when he was 59. Emma had a distinctive green cycling outfit and was nicknamed locally as the Grasshopper. He was still cycling over to visit his siblings at Talbothays in his 70s and would often be seen riding through Puddletown, but with his eyes fixed firmly ahead, so he didn't have to catch the eye of any of his relatives who lived there. He actually also cycled over to Southampton to wave goodbye to the troops going off to the Boer War. That's a distance of about 50 miles. Hardy's return to Dorchester heralded his novel about Dorchester itself, The Mayor of Casterbridge, published first in the Graphic magazine and written while he was living at his Shire Hall home. It tells the tale of the rivalry between Michael Henchard, the mayor of the novel's title, and his young rival, Donald Farfrae. It contains many references to places familiar to Hardy in Dorchester, but the novel begins in Weydon Priors in Upper Wessex, in the village of Weyhill, near Andover, in Hampshire, about 60 miles northeast of Dorchester, and in the most dramatic of fashions. It begins with a drunk, unemployed hairdresser selling his wife to a sailor for 5 guineas after drinking too much furmity laced with rum at Weydon Fair. Now, this was based on a real incident at Weyhill Fair in 1857 and was not an uncommon practice in an age before divorce. Another Dorset custom which gets a mention in the novel is the Skimmington ride, actually last recorded in the village of Oakford, Fitzpaine, as late as 1917. It was a means of shaming a man and woman thought to be guilty of offending public decency. In the novel, an anonymous note sends Farfrae off to Puddletown, Weatherbury, while his new wife, Lucetta, is being shamed in the streets of Dorchester or Casterbridge. By this stage in his life, the wheels had come off his own relationship with his wife, Emma, and the move to Maxgate did nothing to make it better. In 1910, Emma once suggested to Florence Dugdale, who was acting as Hardy's secretary and who she got on very well with, that Hardy looked like Dr. Crippen, who had murdered his wife. I'll let you decide for yourself whether that's a good likeness or not. Obviously, she wasn't very happy with him. And this is the picture of Emma dating from 1905 when she was 65. After living in Maxgate for 10 years, their relationship had become so estranged that Emma chose to live in her attic rooms while Hardy slept in the rooms below. They ate together, but bickered when they had visitors. She felt isolated in Dorset and now didn't get on with Hardy's family. In 1896, she famously wrote a bitter and abusive letter to Hardy's sister Mary, which said, "I can imagine you and your mother and sister on your native heath are raising a storm on Walpurgis night," which obviously didn't go down too well. Nor did she share Hardy's worldview in matters of religion or marriage. He found her extreme religiosity and attempts to dominate the conversation and embarrassment among his literary friends when they visited, although he did approve of her campaign for women's suffrage. She became increasingly left out of his life. When on the morning of the 27th of November 1912, the maidservant came to tell Hardy that his wife was very ill and needed to see her, his first reaction was to rebuke the servant, a young girl, because her collar wasn't straight. When he did go upstairs, Emma was already dying. Hardy's shock at her death was genuine, and he was moved to grief when he read her account of their life together before destroying it. He kept the coffin by his bed for 3 days, changed the date on his desk diary to the 7th of March, 1870, the date when he first went to St. Juliot and met her, and he kept it there until the end of his life. And most importantly for us, he wrote some of the most beautiful love poetry in the English language as he looked back to their first days together in Cornwall. And my favourite is Beanie Clifford, so I'm going to indulge myself. Oh, the opal and the sapphire of the wandering western sea, and the woman riding high above with bright hair flapping free, the woman whom I love so, knew loyally loved me. He ended up writing 115 poems about Emma, but only 5 of these were written before she died. But that was in 1912. In 1887, he had published his first novel, written solely at Max Gate, The Woodlanders, and it was serialized in Macmillan's magazine between May 1886 and April 1887. After it was published, he set off with Emma to explore Florence, Rome, and Venice. The Woodlanders is the story of Giles Winterbourne, who looked and smelt like autumn's very brother, a man born and bred among the orchards, who is loved by Marty South and is in love with Grace Melbury, who marries Dr. Edward Fitzpiers, who is in love with Felice Charmond and also has an affair with Suki Damson. Hardy regarded The Woodlanders as his favourite novel. Interestingly, he had to change the location of the novel. As well as being the place where his mother Jemima had first gone into service, Melbury House had been the place in the novel where Felice Charmond, the lady of the manor, had had an affair with Dr. Edred Fitzpiers, who was married to Grace Melbury, who was loved by Giles Winterbourne, who was loved by Marty South. I'm sure you get the gist. Melbury House was owned by the powerful Fox Strangways family, whom he had earlier offended by writing about their ancestor in a short story called The First Countess of Wessex. Prudently, he moved the location of this house further east. Even in 1887, an established author could not afford to offend the lord of the manor. And to return to Thomas Hardy's life story, Emma had died in 1912, but in 1914, he married again. His wife was a school teacher and children's author who had been an admirer of his work and had acted as his secretary since 1905, when she had written to him and asked to visit. She had been friendly with Emma as well, and a confidant of hers. He was particularly attracted to her large eyes. And here they are on the seashore at Aldeburgh in Suffolk, looking like a happy, newly married couple. If you look at the date, though, it reveals the picture was taken in 1909, 3 years before Emma's death. In that year also, they took frequent trips together to Aldeburgh again, as well as Chichester, York, Durham, and Edinburgh. They'd been married secretly in Enfield, her hometown, on the 10th of February 1914. He was 38 years her senior. In 1891, Hardy published his most famous, and I believe his best novel, Tess of the D'Urbervilles. First of all, a censored serialized version published in the Graphic magazine. To protect Victorian sensibilities in the original version, the dairymaids are carried across the flooded road in a wheelbarrow so that they don't have to put their arms round Angel Clare, quite proper. And then in 3 volumes, uncensored, with the provocative subtitle, A Pure Woman Faithfully Presented. It was originally written between the autumn of 1888 and late 1890. The novel begins in the Vale of Blackmore, the Valley of the Little Dairies, counterintuitively if you're looking out from Bulbarrow or Shaftesbury. In Marlott or Marnhull, the young 16-year-old maiden is innocently engaged in a May dance in the fields when she first encounters Angel Clare, before the tragedy of her accident with the horse drives her into the arms of Alec d'Urberville on the right there, on Cranbourne Chase, and the tragic her pregnancy, the birth of her child, and the tragic loss of her child. Tessie's happiest times, though, were spent in the Valley of the Great Dairies, the valleys of the Froom and the Piddle. Following the death of her child, she travels to Weatherbury, Puddletown, walks from there across Egdon Heath, gets lost on the way, what is now Puddletown Forest, and ascends to a viewpoint, Rain Barrows again, for a view over the Valley of the Great Dairies, the valley in which milk and butter grew to rankness. The Froom waters were clear as the pure river of life shown to the evangelist, rapid as the shadow of a cloud, with pebbly shallows that prattled to the sky all day long. Down below her was Talbothays, Farmer Crick's dairy farm, where she would meet and fall in love with Angel Clare. This was most likely Norris Mill Farm, shown down here, and in, I should say, in Puddletown Parish. In Maxgate, Hardy's life with Florence continued. He became particularly attached to her dog Wessex, which was spoiled rotten, with Emma primarily being cats. Lady Asquith describes him walking about, the dog Wessex, walking about on the table unchecked and fighting her for every mouthful of food. He was the terror of the servants and any callers. He had attacked the postman 3 times, and as a consequence, had lost 2 of his front teeth. That's the dog, not the postman. And here he is. You can just about see him there, stuffed next to the fireplace today at Maxgate. Actually, I've just made that up. That's a cuddly toy. Wessex was buried in the Pets graveyard in the grounds. As a great literary figure, he was visited by the great and good, including the Prince of Wales in 1923. But 2 people he was particularly fond of were the soldier poet Siegfried Sassoon and Private Shaw, also known as T. Lawrence or Lawrence of Arabia. Sassoon had carried a copy of Hardy's selected poems while serving in the trenches, and famously said that he didn't mind dying, but he wanted to finish reading The Return of the Native first. And T. Lawrence was the only person that Wessex would not bite. He obviously didn't like sand in his teeth. He was one of the most frequent visitors to Maxgate, and Florence would form lasting relationships with Lawrence, Sassoon, and J.M. Barrie after Hardy had died. When the First World War broke out in August 1914, Hardy and Florence were dining here in Athelhampton, less than a mile away from Puddletown, at Tudor Manor House. Hardy's close friendship with Sassoon and Lawrence may well have been influenced by the fate of his cousin, Frank William George, his intended heir, who was killed at Gallipoli in August 1915. Hardy was heartbroken. Hardy's penultimate novel was The Pursuit of the Well-Beloved, first published in the Illustrated London News in 1892, but heavily revised and republished as The Well-Beloved in 1897. It's set on Portland, the Isle of Slingers, and tells the story of a sculptor called Jocelyn Pearston, who falls in love successively with 3 generations of the same family seeking female perfection. It seems something of an old man's wish fulfillment novel. Alice's house in the novel is now Portland Museum and was bought for this purpose by Maria Stopes, the advocate of birth control, who was a friend of Hardy's living on Portland. Here also is Walter Paget's picture of Cave Hole on Portland Bill with the second H. Hardy himself suffered a fatal heart attack after being ill for a month and died on the 11th of January 1928. As a national figure, he was expected to be buried in Westminster Abbey, but he and his close family had wanted him to be buried locally in Stinsford, where all his parents and his grandparents were. The compromise that Florence had agreed to was that his heart would be buried with Emma alongside his parents and grandparents, while his cremated body would be entombed in Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey. The pallbearers on that day were Rudyard Kipling, George Bernard Shaw, John Galsworthy, A.E. Housman, J.M. Barrie, Edmund Goss, the heads of 2 Oxford and Cambridge colleges, the Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, and Ramsay MacDonald, the leader of the opposition. His memorial stone can be found next to Charles Dickens and Rudyard Kipling. Not bad for somebody born in the cottage he was born in. Hardy's low-level grave in Stinsford can be seen here in the background, with 2 family graves either side. In the foreground is the grave of the poet C.D. Lewis, who was a big fan of Thomas Hardy and wanted to be buried near him. He was, of course, the father of the American actor Daniel Day-Lewis. So if you do see a man in a stovepipe hat while you're wandering around the graveyard of Stinsford Churchyard, it could be Hardy's grandfather, because Hardy believed in ghosts, or perhaps it's Daniel Day-Lewis still method acting his role as Abraham Lincoln. And no story of Hardy's burial is complete without the story of the cat. According to tradition, the poet's heart was put in a tin overnight, but was discovered by the local cat, a very hungry local cat, in the early hours of the morning. It was rumoured that the cat and the heart altogether ended up in the grave beside Emma. It's a good story, but fortunately it isn't true. The cat would have had to be the size of a puma, but the tin did have a picture of a cat on the front, and it's this which no doubt gave rise to the rumour. Never let the truth get in the way of a good story. I always say. 1895, Hardy's final novel was Jude the Obscure, though he did revise the well-beloved 2 years later and continued to revise all his novels until 1912. In Jude, Hardy's Wessex extended northwards to Mary Green and Reading in Berkshire, Shaftesbury and Salisbury, and even to Oxford, the Christminster of his thwarted ambitions. Here, Jude lodged in an area called Beersheba, obviously based on Jericho. There's a pub called, you will know, called Jude the Obscure there. And he returned to live there with Sue Bridehead, who attended the Church of Ceremonies, St. Silas, based on St. Barnabas. St. Barnabas had been designed by the architect Sir Arthur Blomfield, for whom Hardy had worked in the 1860s. So there was a connection there as well. The reaction to Jude the Obscure was not positive. Many people, including Emma, objected to Hardy's portrayal of Christian marriage and sexual liberation. Critics referred to it as Jude the Obscene and Hardy as Hardy the Degenerate. The Bishop of Wakefield burnt his copy and sent the ashes to Hardy in the post. Mrs. Oliphant, the critic for Blackwood's magazine, described it as disgusting, impious as regards human nature, foul in detail, filth and garbage. And from then on, Hardy vowed not to write another novel, though he would, of course, revise all his novels, as I've said, until 1912. Though he did devote himself to writing poetry for the next 30 years. There is, of course, a Puddletown connection. The inspiration for Jude Fawley, his surname was taken from Hardy's grandmother's place of birth, is to be found in Puddletown. John Antle, a cobbler by trade, had married Thomas Hardy's Aunt Mary, and their wedding procession to Puddletown Church began at Hardy's cottage when Hardy was 7 years old. Over many years, the Antells and the Sparks were the relatives who Hardy and his mother visited most frequently from their Higher Bockhampton home, a short walk across the heathland from what is now Puddletown Forest. John Antell was someone the young Hardy admired. Like Hardy, he was an autodidact who taught himself to read Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. But like Jude, the universities were barred to someone of his class. He turned to drink. At the end of his life, he developed a stomach cancer and posed for this famous photograph with the cynical comment, sic placet, thus it pleases, aimed at a God who he believed had abandoned him. It was a picture Hardy kept, and it's no coincidence that this drawing of Jude at the end of the novel is based on it. When John Antell died in 1878, Hardy wrote a warm obituary to him. And if you ever come to Puddletown, as I hope you will, John Antell's former home is distinctly painted in pink and called Cobblers. The whole of Wessex then has a special place in the novels and life of Dorset's greatest novelist, but Puddletown in particular was close to the author's heart. Not only was it the place from which his ancestors came, both the Hardys and the Hands, but it was a place where many of his uncles, aunts and cousins lived. He had as many as 17 cousins living there at one time. Here are three of the maternal uncles, William, Henry and Christopher Hand. Henry, the one in the middle, always spelt his name Henry, just like Henry Frey in Far From the Madding Crowd. He is the effigy of one of the Martin family knights, on which his poem The Children and Sir Nameless is based, and the market square where the stocks stood, which featured in another poem in The Stocks at Weatherbury. Here's the house at the top right he bought for another cousin, Charles Meek Hardy, who at one time was betrothed to his sister Kate. Here was a church where so many of Hardy's relatives were christened, married and buried, and where he took the composer Gustav Holst when showing him the wonders of Dorset. And the town square there on the right-hand corner has a balcony where the Duke of Monmouth stood to raise the troops before they were all slaughtered at Sedgemoor, and those who weren't were executed by Judge Jeffreys. And Puddleton was lucky enough to get a head and 4 parts to display in the market square. I only tell you this not because I'm macabre, but because Hardy likes stories of the Monmouth Rebellion. I'll leave, however, the final word to Hardy, who wrote about his early romance with his Puddletown cousin, Tryphena Sparks, and their meetings at a Ewelease, a meadow where the sheep grazed near Weatherbury. You can follow in Hardy's footsteps there today. And thank you for listening. And this is the poem. In a Ewelease near Weatherbury. The years have gathered greyly since I danced upon this leas, with one who kindled gaily love's fitful ecstasies. But despite the term as teacher, I remain what I was then, in each essential feature of the fantasies of men. Yet I note the little chisel of ever napping time, defacing ghast and grizzle the blazon of my prime. When at night he thinks me sleeping, I feel him boring sly within my bones and heaping quaintest pains for by and by. Still, I'd gold the world with beauty. I would laugh with her and sing. I would shun the divinest duty to resume her worshipping. But she'd scorn my brave endeavour. She would not balm the breeze by murmuring thine forever, as she did upon this leas. And I hope one day you'll come to Dorset and to Puddletown and have a look at it. And I'll just leave a couple of pictures of Dorset and thank him for putting Dorset on the literary map. Thank you.